Man, are we lucky to be members of the human race. Think about it. No other animal has the kind of leisure time that we do. We have so much leisure time, in fact, that we actually seek out artificial feelings of fear. From riding a roller coaster to my fraternity brother's incessant need to do dumb things, it's clear to see that people like being scared. This exact same desire led to the conception of the horror film genre. For over a century, filmmakers within this genre have been stimulating the most primal fears of their audiences. Possibly none better than young up-and-coming filmmakers Ari Aster and Robert Eggers. I'll first give you a brief overview of the history of horror. Horror first really came into prevalence in the 1920s and 30s with films like Nosferatu, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and The Mummy. According to the New York Film Academy, this is known as the golden age of horror, not only because these films are some of the best horror films to ever be released, but because they are some of the best films of this time period. The next 75 years of horror is largely littered with low-budget gimmicky flicks with too many jump scares or too much gore. Films that stick out in this time period as exceptional are movies like The Shining and Night of the Living Dead. However, there are not as many as you'd like. During this era, we also saw the expansion of some different subgenres, such as the supernatural genre with films like The Omen and The Exorcist, leading up to things we see today like The Conjuring. Another subgenre that exploded during this time period was the slasher genre, created by Alfred Hitchcock in 1960 with his film Psycho. This subgenre really exploded, giving us things like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Michael Myers, eventually in the 90s and 2000s, the Saw movies, and so many more. In the 90s and 2000s, we saw an overproduction of horror films, which led to an exhaustion, and really the public started to have like a great disdain for horror movies because they were so consistently bad. Now that I've given you a brief overview of the history of horror, I'm going to dive into the current renaissance we're experiencing with young filmmakers Ari Aster and Robert Eggers. The first to burst on the scene was Eggers in 2015 with his period piece horror mashup, The Witch. The Witch takes place in 1600s New England and follows a Puritan family that has been outcast from their community and forced to live on the edge of the wood. Robert Eggers terrifies audiences using excellent cinematography, brilliant camera cuts, and constant tension in favor of the more gimmicky things we'd seen in the early 2000s, like gore and jump scares. The next film I'm going to talk about is Ari Aster's feature debut, which was Hereditary. A.O. Scott described the film saying, "Mr. Astor's debut feature is engaging, unsettling, and unpredictable, generating a mood of anxious fascination, punctuated by frequent shocks and a few nervous giggles." I really couldn't agree more with this review. This is my favorite out of the 4 films these two men have made, and I highly recommend you give it a watch. The last movie I'll be talking about is Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse. Released in 2019, the New York Times called it a horror film about inner and outer darkness, and pleasurably unnerving. You may ask, how does he do this? A film called The Lighthouse may be a sea monster, some sort of serial killer. He does not. Eggers uses little more than a foghorn, 2 men, and the psychological effects of isolation and sexual repression. This movie also features incredible performances from both Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe, 2 fantastic actors who are really at their best in this film. The horror genre has taken many turns through the years, and it is being led back in a renaissance by Ari Aster and Robert Eggers. They're using things like superior cinematography and camera work that we see in films like dramas typically, to make these films not only good within their own genre, but fantastic films in total. So maybe next time you're craving an adrenaline rush, skip all that physical exertion, plant yourself on the couch, and pull up an Astor Eggers original.